Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It was a late afternoon when I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, folding laundry that had been piling up for days. The sun filtered gently through the curtains, casting warm stripes across the floor. My son had gone upstairs to grab something, leaving his friend, Daniel, quietly seated across from me. Daniel was a polite boy, the kind you notice for his stillness more than his words. He wasn't the type to fill the room with chatter, yet there was something about his quiet presence that made you look twice, as though he carried something he didn't quite know how to set down. For a while, I busied myself with the soft rhythm of folding shirts, pretending not to notice how silent he was. I could hear the distant hum of the clock on the wall, the faint sound of a car driving past outside. Every now and then, I glanced at him. He kept his hands folded in his lap, his gaze lowered, his shoulders slightly hunched forward. Something about the way he sat made me think he wanted to say something but wasn't sure if he should. I decided not to press him. After all, boys his age often carry their worlds in silence, unsure how to let anyone else in. But I felt it, an unspoken weight hanging between us. It reminded me of when my son was younger, when he used to come to me with questions that seemed small on the surface, but were enormous in his heart. "Do you want some water, Daniel?" I asked gently, trying to break the quiet without intruding. He nodded, almost gratefully, and I poured him a glass. His hand trembled just slightly as he took it, though he tried to hide it. I sat back down, giving him space. The air felt heavier than before, not in a bad way, but in the kind of way that signals something important is about to happen. Finally, after what felt like a long stretch of waiting, he spoke. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain, but it cut through the stillness with the weight of someone carrying far too much for his years. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his eyes finally lifting to meet mine. There was a mixture of fear and relief in his gaze, the kind you see when someone is about to cross a bridge they've been standing on for too long. I set the last folded shirt aside, leaning slightly closer, careful not to rush him. "Yes, Daniel?" He swallowed, his lips pressing together before he spoke again. I don't really talk about this. Not to anyone." His words came haltingly, as though each one cost him something. I nodded, my heart tightening with quiet understanding. I knew that tone. I'd heard it before in other people, in moments when life had pressed too hard against them. "It's all right," I said softly. "You can take your time." He looked down at his hands again, fingers twisting together. For a long moment, I thought maybe he would change his mind, retreat back into that silence where it was safe. But then, with a shaky breath, he let a few words spill out, words that hinted at struggles no boy his age should have to carry. As he spoke, my chest ached, not from judgment, not from shock, but from the simple weight of hearing a young soul trying to steady itself under burdens far too heavy. I didn't interrupt him, didn't try to fix his words with quick answers. I just listened, and in that moment, the kitchen, the folded laundry, even the ticking clock faded away. It was just Daniel and his voice, carrying pieces of himself he'd kept hidden for too long. When he finally paused, the silence that followed was not the same as before. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was lighter, as though he had opened a door he'd been afraid to touch. I reached out, not with words right away, but with the kind of still presence that says, "I hear you. You're not alone." And that was the beginning, the moment when the quiet broke and something far deeper began to take shape between us. a memory that would stay with me long after that afternoon faded into evening. Daniel's words hung in the air long after he spoke them. I could still hear the way his voice shook, the way his eyes darted between the table and mine, as though he feared he'd said too much. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before answering, because I knew that whatever I said next mattered. Sometimes the smallest responses hold the greatest weight. "You don't have to carry this all alone," I said softly. My voice was low, calm, almost like I was speaking to my younger self in another lifetime. His lips parted as though he wanted to reply, but no words came. So I just let the silence rest between us, no longer heavy but instead open, like a field after the rain. The clock ticked on, but time felt slower, stretched thin, as though the moment had carved out its own space in the world. I poured him another glass of water, sliding it gently across the table. His hands, still trembling, reached for it. He nodded in thanks, though his eyes glistened with something he didn't want me to notice. "Does your mom know?" I asked carefully. I wasn't trying to pry, but the thought had crossed my mind, and the answer came in the smallest shake of his head. His shoulders sank lower, as though the very act of admitting that made the burden heavier again. I felt a wave of emotion rise inside me, a mix of sadness and a fierce kind of protectiveness. I thought of my own son upstairs, carefree in his world of school books, friends, and small worries. I thought of how different it might be if he carried something like this, and the thought made my throat tighten. Daniel whispered then, his voice barely audible, "I don't want to disappoint anyone." Those words pierced me. They carried the weight of every young person who has ever felt the need to be stronger than their years, to hide their truth for the sake of others. I leaned forward, folding my hands gently on the table, steadying my tone so he could hear my sincerity. "You're not a disappointment, Daniel. You're human. And humans struggle. That doesn't make you less. It makes you real." For the first time that afternoon, his eyes met mine fully. They were searching, almost desperate, as though trying to decide whether to believe me. And in that gaze, I saw the fragile thread of trust stretching between us. Just then, I heard my son's footsteps upstairs, faint and distant, reminding me that our private moment had an invisible clock ticking over it. But still, I stayed with him. I wanted him to know that someone could sit in the dark corners of his silence without turning away. I shared a small story of my own. Not too much, but enough to let him see that even adults don't have everything figured out. I told him about the times I had carried my own worries in silence, how I once thought I was the only one who felt so weighed down. His face softened as he listened, his shoulders lifting just slightly, as if my words gave him permission to breathe. "I never thought anyone would understand," he murmured. "I may not understand everything," I admitted, "but I promise I'll listen. And sometimes, that's enough to start." He gave the faintest nod, his lips pressing together in something that wasn't quite a smile, but it was closer than the fear that had first gripped his expression. The sound of my son's voice calling from upstairs finally broke the fragile stillness. Daniel straightened quickly, almost as if retreating back into himself, but the trace of relief on his face told me the moment had mattered. As he left the kitchen to join my son, I stayed behind for a while, my hand resting on the folded laundry, my thoughts racing. I knew something had shifted. That afternoon wasn't just another visit from one of my son's friends. It was the start of a story that would etch itself into my memory, because in Daniel's quiet voice, I had heard both his breaking and his bravery. The days after that afternoon seemed almost ordinary on the surface. Daniel still came by to visit my son, and they'd disappear upstairs with laughter and games, leaving me to my chores and quiet routines. But beneath that ordinariness, I carried the memory of his trembling voice, the way he'd finally spoken after holding so much inside. It stayed with me like a faint echo, reminding me that sometimes the things unsaid are louder than anything else. One Saturday evening, they were both supposed to go out for a game at the school, but my son ended up feeling unwell. Daniel stayed behind, lingering in the living room after checking on him. The glow of the lamp cast soft circles of light on the walls, and outside the wind rattled faintly against the windows. My son had gone to bed early, leaving just the two of us. Daniel sat quietly, much as he had before, but this time his silence was different. It wasn't the guarded quiet of someone afraid to speak. It was the hesitant calm of someone deciding whether or not to continue. I felt it, the way you feel a storm waiting on the horizon. I set down the book I'd been pretending to read and looked at him. You've been carrying more than you let people see, haven't you? His eyes flickered toward me, and he gave the smallest nod, almost as though admitting it was both frightening and freeing at once. He drew in a shaky breath. It's just, sometimes it feels like I don't belong anywhere. Not at school, not even at home. Those words struck me deep. I thought of all the times people carry that same weight into adulthood. The feeling of being present but never truly seen. I leaned forward, my voice steady, trying to give him the space he needed. You do belong, Daniel, and the fact that you feel this way doesn't make you less. It means you're searching for your place, and that takes courage. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. The words began to spill more easily now, pieces of his struggle tumbling into the open. The loneliness, the pressure to seem fine, the fear of letting anyone see beneath the surface. His hands twisted in his lap as he spoke, his voice wavering between quiet strength and breaking vulnerability. I listened, not with advice ready at my lips, not with judgment, but with the kind of attention I'd once wished someone had given me when I was younger. Every so often, I would nod or softly affirm his words, just enough to let him know he wasn't speaking into emptiness. When he paused, I shared something I hadn't spoken of in years. How, as a young woman, I too had moments when the world felt too large, and I felt too small to fit in it. I told him about the nights I sat awake wondering if anyone would ever truly notice me, and how those feelings shaped me, though I never admitted them to anyone at the time. His eyes widened slightly as he listened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of recognition, a silent understanding that he wasn't as alone as he thought. The room seemed smaller then, not from closeness, but from the way two people can bridge distance simply by sharing their truths. Outside, the wind quieted, and the stillness inside felt softer, warmer, more alive. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. I've never said this out loud before. That makes this moment important, I said gently, and I'm honored you trusted me with it. His lips curved into a faint, weary smile. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was something, a small step toward the light after being in the dark too long. By the time he left that evening, the air between us had shifted again. He walked out the door standing just a little taller, his shoulders less hunched, as though speaking his truths had lifted part of the burden he carried. I watched him go, my heart heavy but hopeful, knowing that the conversation wasn't finished, that maybe it never would be. And as I turned off the lamp and headed upstairs, I realized something. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with grand gestures, but with a quiet conversation in a softly lit room, when one person dares to speak and another dares to listen. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. The final turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, several weeks after that night in the living room. The house was filled with the smell of a roast cooking slowly in the oven, and the hum of the dryer rolled softly in the background. My son had gone with his father to visit relatives, leaving me alone when Daniel stopped by, thinking he'd find my son home. He looked almost startled when I opened the door. For a moment, I thought he might retreat, but instead he hesitated, then asked if he could stay for a little while. There was something in his eyes that told me he needed this visit more than he cared to admit. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where it all had begun. The familiarity of the setting seemed to soften him. His fingers traced the grain of the wood, his eyes distant, and I could sense that whatever he had to say this time was heavier than before. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "thank you for listening the other times. I didn't think anyone would ever hear me." His voice was stronger than before, though still edged with that same fragility. I gave him a reassuring smile. Sometimes being heard is the first step toward healing. "You've been brave, Daniel." His shoulders lifted, and he looked at me with a mixture of relief and resolve. Then he began to share more deeply than ever before, not just the surface fears or the loneliness, but the story of what had truly weighed him down. He spoke about the feeling of being invisible in his own home, the way his struggles were dismissed as phases, and how he'd learned to hide behind silence so no one could label him a burden. As he spoke, my eyes welled with tears I tried to blink away, not because I pitied him, but because I felt the raw humanity of his words. Every sentence carried years of quiet suffering that no child, no young man, should have to carry alone. When he finally stopped, the room felt so still I could hear the faint ticking of the clock. I reached across the table, resting my hand gently over his. "Daniel, what you've gone through doesn't define your worth. You're not invisible, not here, not to me. And someday you'll find that others will see you too. But for now, I want you to remember this. Your voice matters." He nodded slowly, his lips pressing together, and then, something I'll never forget, he exhaled with a trembling sound, almost like the first true breath after holding one's lungs tight for too long. His eyes glistened, but this time they weren't only filled with sorrow. There was relief, even the faint glimmer of hope. We sat like that for a while, in the kind of silence that doesn't need words. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft streaks of gold and lavender. It felt symbolic somehow, as though the day itself was reminding us that even endings carry beauty, and that darkness is never the final word. Before he left, Daniel turned to me at the door. His voice was steadier now. "I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't talked to you. I won't forget this." Neither would I. Watching him walk down the path, I felt a profound mix of sorrow and gratitude. Sorrow that he had carried so much pain in silence, but gratitude that he had chosen to open up, that I had been given the chance to hear him, to witness his courage. That night, as I tie-dyed the kitchen and prepared for the new week, I thought about the power of listening, about how so often the difference between despair and hope is simply one person willing to sit quietly and truly hear another. And I knew then that Daniel's visit had left something permanent in me too, because it isn't just the speaker who is changed in these moments, it's the listener as well. I had been reminded of the quiet strength it takes to speak, the patience it takes to listen, and the bond that forms when two souls meet in honesty. Even now, years later, whenever I think back to that Sunday afternoon, I still feel it. The moment when silence gave way to truth, when a boy's voice finally found a place to rest, and when I realized that sometimes the most unforgettable stories happen not in grand events, but in the quiet of a kitchen, over folded hands and shared words.